Hey there. I'm excited to announce this to you today. This is what you've been waiting for in your spiritual quest. This is something I've wanted to do for a long time, and I'm finally ready to announce it that it's ready to go. It's the Grief to Growth Community Circle. Now, this is a sanctuary where like-minded souls are united in their journey through grief and towards personal transformation. It's more than just a place. It's a beginning. It's a commitment to growth and understanding. Here you're finding not just a community, but you're entering a circle of trust and depth. You're going to engage with interactive coursework. You'll dive into exclusive podcast episodes and partake in discussions that illuminate the path from mourning to empowerment. This is a realm where every question is honored and every individual's journey is validated. To be part of this exclusive circle, visit us at grieftogrowth.com/community or look for the chat icon at the bottom of every page on the main website. Remember that entry is a privilege because I want to ensure that every member is as dedicated and genuine as you are. You must apply to join, but the journey within is worth every step. So go ahead and join us today. Check it out, grieftogrowth.com/community, and I look forward to seeing you there.
Hi there. Welcome to Grief to Growth Podcast. Your host is Brian Smith, spiritual seeker, best-selling author, grief survivor, and life coach. Brian believes that the worst tragedies of life provide the greatest opportunity for growth. Brian says he was planted, not buried, and he is here to help you grow where you've been planted by the difficulties in life. In each episode, Brian and his guests will share what has helped them to survive and thrive. It is his sincere hope this episode helps you today.
Hey, everybody, this is Brian back with another episode of Grief to Growth. And today I've got with me a gentleman. His name is Rich Curtis. And Rich Curtis is an author. He's always been a guide. He spent over a decade as a raft guide. He's been a backpacking guide. He's now a real estate entrepreneur. He's a best-selling author, and he's a success coach. He guides, coaches, writes, and speaks to help entrepreneurs, CEOs, adventurers, and go-getters rewrite their stories. We're going to talk about what that means to rewrite your story. Helps them to get unstuck and how to live their dreams. And as a story expert and as a passionate student of neuroscience, positive psychology, and behavioral psychology, Rich believes in a world where people are invested in the process of being better tomorrow than they are today. And his life work includes his book, Change Your Story, Change Your Life, have been about helping people to get there. So outside of work, Rich is a dedicated father of two. We just talked about. He's got two little energetic kids. He's a husband, he's a traveler, and he's an outdoor adventurer. So with that, I want to welcome to Grief to Growth, Rich Curtis.
Thanks for having me, Brian. I'm excited to be here. I love the name. I love the concept of taking grief and using that to move forward and grow. So I'm excited to be here and chat with you today.
Yeah, well, I love the title of your book, because I think that's a very important part of dealing with grief is the story that we tell ourselves. So what I want to get started with is asking you, because I know you talk a lot about story. And people might say, well, my story is just what happened to me. I can't change my story. The story is what it is. So what does it mean to change our story?
Yeah, it's funny because in my coaching practice, I run up against that. As soon as we dive into narrative work, you get that, well, no, this is static. This is truth. This is what it is. This is what happened. But what you find when you start diving into the science of story, how our brains compile stories, and even how our senses work, our stories are heavily filtered personal virtual realities of what happened. In fact, if you and I experience the same moment and we write our stories down about it, there's a nearly 0% chance that we're going to write the same story about that moment. And the science of that is really kind of interesting, where you're parsing so much data. We've got like 11 million bits of information hitting us right now while you and I are talking. Mm-hmm. Now, if you had to actively engage with all that information, you'd be just a quivering mass of overwhelm. You wouldn't be able to do anything. Mm-hmm. And so your brain creates all these filters to filter out all the stuff you don't need and the stuff you've already engaged with. And it makes these just intense filters for the world. And those filters are essentially your stories. Once you've set those filters, nothing gets in or out that isn't part of those filters. So for new information to get in, you have to be knocked off your game, or you have to actively do the work of suspending some of those filters. Now, you are actively engaging right now with like 40 to 60 of those 11 million bits, depending on the study you read, right? So you're parsing the data down to just an infinitesimally small amount, and then you're compiling your stories from that tiny bit of information. Now you add to that your brain has an anthropological precept for writing bad stories, right? Because there were 15 other hominids running around, trying to become the dominant hominid. And we didn't win because we were the biggest and the toughest. We won because we were the scariest and because we can cooperate. So we got really good at hearing a twig break in the woods and saying, that's a saber-toothed tiger, I better run. I was great when there were saber-toothed tigers in the woods. Now that most of us don't live with immediate threats to life, unfortunately not all of us, but most of us don't live with immediate daily threats to life, what our brain does is it patterns for the negative. So you're taking in the smallest bits of information, you're filtering them through your emotions and your past experiences, you're preset to pick the worst and most negative bits of information. And that's what we're writing these stories from. So you can imagine, 11 million bits of information. The average dictionary has about 1 million letters in it. So if I gave you 11 dictionaries, said you can pick 40 letters, you can have duplicates. Obviously, we only got 26 characters. Write me a story out of 40 out of these 11 million letters. And then you hand me the same stack and tell me to do the same thing. The odds that we're going to write the same story are essentially zero. And so we think these things are truth and are empirical and are set in stone, but they're not. And part of that is also because we're in love with our senses. We think our senses are empirical. Like what I'm seeing of you on the camera right now is not what you look like. And that's a mind blower, right? Like I'm looking at you, but if I drew my picture of you and you drew your picture of you, they're going to be very, very different because I'm filtering you through all the experiences I've had with other men with glasses, fathers, podcasters. All these filters are in there to affect what I think of you and the picture we send to our brain. Mm-hmm. And one of the most powerful examples is the early astronaut program. They thought floating upside down in space would make the astronauts go nuts. And they wanted to test it before they put them in orbit. So they strapped these goggles on them that inverted their view of the world for 30 days. And they couldn't take them off, sleeping, nothing. They had to wear them. And lots of disorientation and accidents and bumps and bruises ensued. But on day 26, one of the astronauts woke up and the world was right side up again, even though he's still wearing his goggles. Because his brain had for 35 years seen the world right side up. And now for 26 days, it was seeing the world upside down. And it said, it doesn't matter the picture that's coming in. I know that's wrong. I'm going to fix it. And it righted the world. And by the end of the 30 days, all of the astronauts experienced the same thing. The world was right side up again. Yeah. So your brain is literally changing what you see. Your sight is not an empirical picture of the world. It's filtered through your experiences and your past emotions. So the first step in the process of engaging with doing narrative work and rewriting your stories, and especially your stories around traumatic events like grief, is letting go of the concept of truth. Not in sort of this sort of political post-truth environment we've all just been through. I don't mean it like that. There are things that are true. But when it comes to your stories and the way you compile them, this is not truth. This is just a version of the truth. And if you are the one writing them, and you're the one writing these stories, you're the one doing this work, even though it's subconscious, why would you write such terrible stories for yourself? Like when you think of the stories, not the stories you tell at a cocktail party, but the late night with a whiskey on the couch story that you tell yourself, right? You'd never say that out loud. You never stand up in front of a party of people and say, I totally suck at everything, right? I'm fat. I'm a loser. I'll never get anywhere in life. I'm a bad dad, whatever it is. Those stories you tell yourself, you'd never say that out loud, but those are the stories you're living out and they're affecting your life in a really dramatic way. Mm-hmm. So once you realize your stories aren't true and you're in control of them, then you sort of have to step back and say, why am I writing such crappy stories for myself? Why am I living out such horrible stories? And then you can engage with the science and the process of rewriting them to take your life where you want to go. Yeah.
Yeah. I think something you said there was really important that I want to emphasize. You said a lot what you said was very important, but I want to emphasize something because I think people have this question, why do we write such bad stories? Why do we focus on the negative? And I say the same thing to my clients. It's evolutionary. It's the way our brains are wired, is to focus on what's wrong so we can fix what's wrong. And that doesn't always serve us. So I want to give people, it's okay if you're doing this, right? Because we all do it. As you and I know, talking to people, we know that when people come to us, they all do it. I'm a terrible person. I'm a terrible father. I'm just a loser. Everybody else, I'm a poser. Everybody else is good and I'm not.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hey there, something I want to tell you about today. My podcast platform, Buzzsprout, has recently made it easier for me to allow you to support me financially. Go to www.grieftogrowth.com/subscribe. That's growth2growth.com/subscribe. And once you're there, you can sign up to support me financially. Now, you can do it for as little as $3 a month, or of course, as much as you'd like. If you do that, you'll get access to bonus episodes, and you'll see those in the regular feed. They'll have a lock on them. But when you become a subscriber, you'll actually get access to your own private feed, and you'll be able to listen to the regular podcast along with the bonus podcast for the subscribers. I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank you for sharing the podcast. And I want to thank those of you who support me financially. Have a great day, and on to the episode.
Yeah. And it's hard to work in the personal development industry in a way that's humble and walks alongside people, which is what you're talking about, is saying, hey, it's okay that you're not broken, you're not damaged, you're not doing something wrong. You are living out your evolutionary destiny. This is how you're wired to work. So we're just trying to give you tools to help circumvent that and have better outcomes. And my brain works just like your brain. And I suffer in the same ways you suffer. I just suffered enough that I got to a breaking point that I decided there had to be a better way, and I went out to find it. And I think sometimes we give people new names for their problems and let them keep them in the personal development. We're like, okay, I'm just projecting, or I had a bad childhood, or I've got a bad story, and it makes people feel better. I can name this thing. But then we don't force the issue of doing the work to actually fix it, because doing the work doesn't sell books, right? If the title of your book was spend the next 6 months doing the hard work of rewriting all the narratives in your life so you can be better, right? That would sell approximately 1 copy to your mom.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But 4 easy steps to change your life in 15 minutes, boom, you'll sell, 100,000 of those. And so a little bit like those of us who do this work, we need to step back and admit to people that this stuff is simple. It's not rocket science. I'm not smarter than you. My brain works the same way your brain works. I just suffered enough that I was willing to do the work.
Yeah.
And that's it. The process is actually the doing of the work. And unfortunately, it's like anything good in life, it's work. It's not, it's simple, but you gotta slog it out. You gotta put in the effort. And I think grief, the death of my mom is what forced me to engage with the work,
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. That was actually, you led into my next question. I was wondering what it was that prompted you to do the work, because typically, again, evolutionary, we do the simplest thing that's working or kind of working until it doesn't work anymore. That's evolution. That's fine. Okay. But that's not being lazy. That's just being efficient. But it's something that comes along that knocks us off of that course, typically, that drives us to do this work. So for you, it sounds like it was the passing of your mother.
It was, yeah. And sort of, I mean, the passing of a parent's always traumatic, and you think, but how did that knock you off your game so bad? But it was really sudden. And I had some bad stories that kind of compounded it. So my mom died about 41 days before the birth of my first child. So that was part of it. Was she never got to meet him. And my mom she had 5 children of her own, and she'd never met a child in her whole life that wasn't like her child, under her protection immediately. She was just, her whole essence, her whole being was mom. All of my friends growing up called her mom. So that's kind of who she was. But the day she died was really sudden and unexpected. So we thought that she had a hernia, and they sent us home, and she had an infection associated with that. And then the infection got out of control. And within 3 days, we were bringing her into the hospital. And then she spent about 14 hours in the hospital in the dying process, dying from sepsis. And so part of that, what made that harder for me, was having been a raft guide and a mountain guide. I had this sort of classic male savior complex, like nobody dies on my watch. Right.
Yeah.
And then I had a lot of experiences that confirmed that, right. I had some confirmation bias. Like I'd had heart attacks and broken ankles and cracked ribs and cracked heads, and I'd always gotten those people out safe. Right. And so, my mom had a DNR, a do not resuscitate order. So for those of you who don't know what that means, that basically means that if we know this is only going one way, you're going to die today, then you have to stop working on me and let it take its course.
Right.
Which is counter to my training as a first responder in medicine. We're trained, you just keep doing things until you pass out or give the person to somebody who knows more than you.
Right.
And so to sit on my hands and watch her die for 14 hours was really, really hard for me personally. I think it hit me maybe even more than my other 4 brothers in a way, because I'm so used to stepping in and doing things when people are having that process.
Yeah.
So about 2 years after her death, so she passed away, and I went into 2 years of just intense suffering. depression. I call them in the book the failed states: frustration, anger, irritability, loss of self-care, exile, depression, all of it. But what was amazing about it was I was a functional dad. I was a pretty good dad, as good of a dad as I am today, as good of a dad as I know how to be. I was probably not a great husband. I was probably pretty challenging and emotional to deal with for a new mom. Unfortunately, my wife gave me a lot of grace, and I thank her for that. Yeah. And I was a really functional, high earning entrepreneur in the real estate industry. And so from the outside, if you went out and had drinks with me, you had no idea the depths to which I was suffering. Right. You had no idea that I was getting up in the morning, sitting on the edge of the bed and thinking, is this all there's going to be for the rest of my life? Am I going to feel like this? You had no idea that I was driving around town at just ridiculously unsafe speeds, playing loud, angry music, on a couple of occasions, nearly picking fist fights, which is completely out of my my normal emotional range, because I had so much anger and frustration pent up inside me. Mm-hmm. And it all came to a head. I think some people have their epiphanies with like a religious leader, or on the slopes of the Andes taking ayahuasca under the stars, right? I was circling a Costco in my truck and having an argument with my brother. And I was fighting with my brother over the phone. And I'd been circling the Costco long enough that even a security guard had started to follow me in his little golf cart. He's trying to chase me down, but I didn't see him. And the culmination of this was I screamed into the phone to my brother, look, I'm failing you. I'm failing Ann. That's my wife. And we failed mom. We just stood there and watched her die. She fought for all 5 of us every day of her life, and we did nothing. We just watched her die. And when that story came flying out of me, I hit the brakes on the truck. Little security guard guy almost nailed me in the back of the truck. And I was just stunned. I was completely frozen in place, because I didn't know that story was in me. Never in the 2 years since her passing had I engaged with that concept. Had I said out loud, I failed my mom. I didn't fight for her. Nobody in my family had ever said that or even implied that that was something that happened that day. Mm-hmm. So that was the source of all my pain. That was sticking your finger in the bullet wound. Like that was it. That was what was causing everything for me, was this story. And I didn't even know it was there. And so that moment, I had to ask myself a couple of questions. One, is it true? 2, even if it's true, does it matter? Even if it's true, is it serving me? And the answer was no, it's not the truth of that day. And it's not serving me. It's practically killing me. And so I set into a 2-year sort of deep dive into the science of happiness and the science of story to figure out how to correct this, how to change this narrative. And the first step was looking at that day my mom died. So I actually went back through that day and said, well, at 4 a.m, my dad asked me to get the DNR. And so I get the DNR and I brought it down to the hospital. And I asked my mom to rescind it. She was still, cogent enough to do that. And you can rescind it verbally. And she said, no, she wanted it to stand. And I handed it over. Even though I knew what that meant, I didn't want to hand that. Doctor practically ripped it, pulling it out of my hand. Then my mom was deeply religious, and I'm not per se, but so we got the priest in to do the final sacraments for her, the Catholic priest, to make her more comfortable. We were not telling anybody the name of our son, so we were keeping it to ourselves until he was born. And so I leaned over and whispered in her ear the name of my son. His middle name is for my father, is named after my father. So I whispered that in her ear, so she would at least have his name to carry with her, to the other side. Mm-hmm. Later in the day, my dad couldn't. They were married, 50 years. They were best friends. I had a tremendous relationship. He couldn't get near her because of the hospital bed rail. So and I couldn't figure the thing out. So I got the nurse over to get the rail down so Dad could get closer, get into bed and hold her. We called the whole family. By the moment she died, there were 18 people in the room. Each of them had a hand on her in some way. And then she had this mask on for oxygen, and it was freaking her out. She never liked things on her face. And Dad said to me, that thing's freaking her out. So I went to the nurse. I said, what's that thing doing? She says, it'll prolong her life 10 minutes. I said, get that off of her face, And so I was able to go back and look at that day and rewrite the story of that day into, I fought for my mom in every way I could while respecting her right to die her way. Yeah. Because that is also true. Because the hardest thing I've ever done in my life was to stand there and do nothing and put my hand on my mom and watch her go through the process of dying. I don't know if you were present when your daughter passed, or if you've been present when anybody passed, but my reaction was to run from it. My reaction was to not experience it. I was crumbling inside. I wanted to run. I wanted to go. I wanted to escape. And it took every, ounce of resolve I had to keep my hand on her leg, my eyes on her eyes, and watch until she took her last breath. Right. And that's also the truth of that day. So you can say that I stood there and did nothing and didn't fight for my mom and just watched her die. And that's true. But you can also say that I fought for my mom in every way I could while respecting her right to die her way. That's also true. Both those stories are true. Both are written by me. One was destroying my life. One of them sets me free. Mm-hmm. And that's the power of rewriting your narrative, especially out of a traumatic or grief event.
Yeah. I think, Rich, that what you just said is so incredibly powerful. And I thank you for sharing that with people, because I think sometimes people feel alone in this thing that they're going through. And we do, we write the worst stories for ourselves, things that, if your friend came and told you that story, you would say, you're insane. That's not what happened. But you tell yourself the story, and you carry it around for until it pretty much broke you, or until you realized, okay, this story is not working for me. And I think it's really powerful to tell people you can choose your story. You can't choose your facts, right? But you can choose how you interpret those facts. And that's very, very powerful.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hi there. I'm really excited to tell you about my latest ebook. It's 4 lessons that you can learn from the near-death experience without going through all the trouble of dying to learn them. I've been studying NDEs for several years now. I am completely convinced that not only are they 100% real, but that there's some very universal wisdom that we can get from the near-death experience. And I've distilled that down in this book into 4 short lessons. And I've also given you all the reasons why I believe that NDEs are absolutely real. So go to www.grieftogrowth.com/NDE lessons to pick it up for free. www.growth.com/NDE lessons. I hope you enjoy it.
Yeah. And it comes with practice, and it comes with just making a decision about how you want to feel, right? Like, you have to sort of draw a line in the sand and say, from today forward, there's going to be one person in the world that doesn't tell me how bad I suck. And that's going to be me. Right? Like, I'm in control of this thing. I'm going to make a choice about how I want to feel. When I taught whitewater raft guide school for 16 years, and we'd give them these 3 mantras to learn how to guide. And one of them was point where you want to go and get there. Because people get in a raft and they try to drive it like a car because that's what they know, right? But driving a raft, the road is like a greased up Teflon conveyor belt that just keeps pushing you towards your obstacles.
Right.
And so driving it like a car doesn't work. So what happens is, and they hear the guide, what they hear me saying, and it looks like it works, is all forward. Mm-hmm. So they jump in the back and they do nothing with the direction of the boat. They scream all forward, and we paddle until we hit something, usually shore. And then they turn the boat away from that obstacle. Like you were saying, people don't change direction until they hit something, until something knocks them off course. And then they paddle to the other shore, and then they paddle to the middle and slam a rock. And they do this until we get them to calm down, and we tell them, point where you want to go and get there. You need to initiate direction before momentum in your life. And part of the reason that we don't take time to evaluate these stories and change our direction is that we're moving 1,000,000 miles an hour in our lives right now. Mm-hmm. We don't have built-in periods of self-reflection. We don't have built-in patterns or time in our schedule to take and assess these things and even have a moment to try to change that direction. So we've just got the pedal down. We're doing our careers. We're taking care of our kids. We're moving forward. And then we take a hit in life, and it knocks us off course. And now we're going this way, and we go this way until we hit something else. And life is not meant to be a series of hits that you take that drive you to an unknown destination. Life is meant to be a series of course corrections from those hits to get back to where you want to go. Mm-hmm. And as you know, after grief, the destination you're heading for might not be the same one it was before, but it still has to be an intentional one. We want to be living an examined and intentional life and pointing to the end destination where we want to go. And our stories are how we get there. It's how we program our brain to take us where we want to go.
Yeah. I love that, direction before momentum. I think that is so awesome, because we tend to just, and I'm just going to reiterate what you said, we tend to just go. And sometimes not even the direction we want to go in. And we don't realize that we could stop. We can slow down, and we can, set an intention and set a direction. And that's exactly what you're talking about today. So why is it you think that story is such a powerful tool for life change?
Well, you can think of story as a programming code for your brain. So if I was to sit down and program a website right now, I wouldn't type into the computer, make the background red, right? Nothing would happen. I have to type in some HTML to make it do that. And so, story is that programming code for your brain. It's how we access that filter database. We talked earlier, we have these filters that heavily parse the information so we can go on about our days. And we don't ever have a chance to get in there and muck with the filters and change them. And the way we do that, the way we access them, is through story. That's the programming code to get into your brain. So if you have an area of your life that's not working, and it doesn't have to be something as dramatic as what I went through with grief, it can be anything. You could be not where you want in your career, not where you want fitness wise, not where you want relationship wise, any part of your life that isn't working for you. You can stop and say, what's my story about this? Is it true? Even if it's true, is it serving me? And if not, there's a story evolution process I teach in the book for you to go through and rewrite that story and change it. And so that story is so powerful because it allows you to access that filter database. And the way it does that and the parts of your brain it does that in are really interesting and compelling. There's a woman in LA, a really brilliant neuroscience researcher, Mary Helen Immordino-Yang. I cite her research in the book. She has a great book of her own and some TED Talks you can watch too. Look her up. She's awesome. And she focuses on education. But what she's found is if you tell someone an inspiring story or an impactful story, maybe even as I was telling the story of my mom, the day of my mom's death, and you then put them on an fMRI machine, you'll see 3 different parts of the brain light up. And the midbrain lights up, which isn't the most interesting part. The insula lights up, which is actually 2 parts of your brain, one on the left and right, responsible for your gut function. So that's why you get that gut feeling or that tingling feeling when you hear an inspiring story, because you've actually turned on the part of the brain that controls the gut function. So that part's interesting. But the most interesting part is that it lights up the medulla. The medulla is like a little cluster back here. It's the oldest part of your brain. It's responsible for your biological survival. It does mundane tasks like keeping you breathing when you're sleeping, keeping your blood pressure regulated. And so you'd think evolutionarily, we would have built an impenetrable firewall around that, right? Like you take a hit there, a big enough hit, and they can't even keep you alive on life support for more than 15 minutes. This is a really important part of your brain. But there is no firewall. All I have to do is tell you an inspiring or impactful story, and I can light that up, which means 2 things. You're getting blood flow to it and you're getting electricity to it, which means we've just changed you at the neural level in the survival center of your brain by telling you a story. So the conclusion that Immordino-Yang makes is that our social selves and our biological selves are intimately linked. So our stories and our social interactions are intimately linked with our biological survival. These 2 things are not separate. And I would take that even a step further to say that our emotional state affects our physical survival with this interaction with story. That's how powerful this is. So when you think about it, if I can tell you an inspiring story and I can light up the biological survival center of your brain, what kind of damage do you think you're doing to yourself on a daily basis with all the negative stories that you have, playing, the negative tape you have playing in your head all the time? And so we sort of have this perfect storm of have an anthropological preset to write negative stories, stories having a dramatic impact on us, and not having sort of processes and procedures in place to take an active role in the rewriting of those stories. Right. And that perfect storm makes people suffer. And that was the biggest realization for me after 2 years of depression. I wouldn't have even during the time said I was depressed. It's still a little bit painful because of some of the bad male stories I have from being the youngest of 5 Irish boys to even admit that I was depressed. But I realize if you look around, everyone around you is suffering. Everyone around you is taking a hit. Everyone around you is dealing with something. And that's something that I didn't really understand before this happened. And in fact, the book subtitle had suffering in it. People hated that word so much. It tested so poorly. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, people don't want to talk about it or face the fact that we are all suffering. It's very unpopular to say so, but I'm a big fan of Buddhism. That's kind of like at the core of Buddhism. The Buddha says life is suffering. We can work our way out, but we have to first admit that it is, because life doesn't always go the way we want it to go.
Yeah, and I think that's especially a Western fallacy now, and especially in the age of social media, people view their life as like a up and to the right hockey stick on the line graph, right? Like we go from like less good to killing it, and that's how this works. And that's life is like this. You take these hits, all throughout your life, and you can continue an up and to the right trajectory if you develop the skills you need to course correct and bounce back from the hits. But if you just take the hits and let them send you where they're going, then you're kind of all over the place. And so that suffering mechanism and trying to work beyond the suffering using your stories is kind of the core work of getting your life back on track, is acknowledging that you're suffering, and then being willing to make that change. And for some people, they can do it before it gets really, really bad. And for me, because I just wasn't willing to admit it or engage with it, it had to get really, really bad before I started to do the work.
Yeah, well, that's why I call it rock bottom, and that's most of us have to hit that. As we were saying earlier, that's just kind of evolutionary. We're going to keep going until we hit that wall. So, how do we identify the bad stories in our life, the stories that we want to rewrite? How do we figure out which ones we need to work on?
Yeah, and the best way to do that is using two things. One, thinking about areas of your life that just don't work. We all know the areas we struggle with, right? In fact, you'll talk to people who have struggled with weight their whole life, and they lose 100 pounds and they still feel the same. They're healthier, but they still feel the same. And that's because they haven't rewritten that story. They had the same story about their health, fitness, and weight before they lost the weight, and the same story afterwards. And I tell people, like when I used to climb mountains, I'd tell people, put exactly what you need in the bag, because when we reach the top, there's nothing there except what you brought with you. Mm. And that's the same in life. If you can't feel it now, you won't feel it then, right? Yeah. If you want to have self-love, it's not, your self-love isn't on the other side of 100 pounds. It starts now, right? And so when it comes to doing this kind of work, you first, you have to think about an area of your life that you're not happy with, that you've struggled with consistently, that you'd like to make a change in. Mm-hmm. And then you just ask yourself some powerful questions. What's my story about this, right? And then you ask yourself, is that true? And then you ask yourself, even if it's true, is that story serving me? Now, if it's an area you've been struggling with for a long time, whether the story's true or not doesn't really matter. Only that second question matters. Is it serving me?
Right.
And if it's making you suffer, then it's not serving you. So once you've identified that story, you can go into what I call the story evolution process. It's not a full rewrite, because it's still at the end is based in the same story. My story of the day my mom died, we didn't fight for my mom. We just stood there and watched her die, versus I fought for my mom in every way I could while respecting her right to die her way. Mm-hmm. Those two stories are still rooted in the same story, in the truth of that moment. I just evolved that story from one that didn't serve me into one that does serve me.
Right.
And so the first step of that process, once you've done the work to identify the area of your life that's not working, you said, what's my story about this? Is it true? And is it serving me? Then you got to write it down. So this thing is physically a part of you. You have neural pathways that go right to this. If I got triggered about the day my mom died, boom, that story's right there, right? And the only way you can begin to work on it and change it is to make it not a part of you, is to get it outside of you. So you write it out, and you just write the whole thing out with no filter, no trying to pretty it up. You just write it as it is. And then the next step is to say it out loud. And I actually encourage people to videotape themselves doing this. You set your cell phone up, and the first time you say it out loud, record yourself. And people often balk at this one. They think that feels kind of funny. I don't want to do that. But you will see on your face, when you tell a story that's causing you pain and suffering, you will see on your face twinges, cringes, ticks when you say the bad parts. When you say the parts that are hurting you, you'll see it. You will see how that story is making you suffer. Mm-hmm. And that makes a big impact, and it helps you do the work of rewriting the story. Because after you've done that, after you've said it out loud, you're going to start the rewriting process. And that's simply just marking those parts of the story that don't serve you, the negative parts, the bad parts, the parts that were causing you pain, the parts that you saw your face react to on the video. And I did this with my son recently in terms of distance learning. He's a 7-year-old kid, loves learning. If he goes to the internet, he's on Nat Geo Kids, right? He just loves school, loves people, loves learning. And he came to me and was throwing a fit about going to distance learning during the whole COVID thing. And so, I hate school, Dad. Mm-hmm. I was like, really? That doesn't sound like you, And I said, well, tell me your whole story. And I recorded him with my phone, telling the story, and I played it back. And I said, does that look good for you? Do you look happy? And he says, no, I look terrible. I look terrible when I'm saying that. And I said, well, let's get to the point where you don't look terrible. Mm. And we redid the whole thing. And then I videotaped him telling his new story, which was, basically distance learning sucks, but I still get a chance to see my friends, teachers, and learn. It didn't deny the truth of it. I tried to get the distance learning sucks part out, because I thought it would, Dad, and I thought it'd be better for him to not have that part in there. And and I said, well, does that sound true? He says, no, distance learning sucks. I said, okay, then it has to be in there. That's the truth of it for you.
Right.
We'll get back to Grief to Growth in just a few seconds. Did you know that Brian is an author and a life coach? If you're grieving or know someone who is grieving, his book, Grief to Growth, is a best-selling, easy-to-read book that might help you or someone you know. People work with Brian as a life coach to break through barriers and live their best lives. You can find out more about Brian and what he offers at www.grieftogrowth.com, www.growth.com. If you'd like to support this podcast, visit www.patreon.com/grieftogrowth, www.patreon.com/GRIEF2GROWTH to make a financial contribution. And now back to Grief to Growth.
So the story was still true, but it was positive. And then you could see on his face when we re-recorded him how light, bright, and freed he was. And from that moment forward, we had no distance learning fights. He sat there and he did the work and he felt better about it and he moved on. So there's a really, and I teach this for kids too, with in combination with another bit of neurological research called power poses. This work is really powerful with kids because they're so malleable and open to suggestion. It really, you can really help your kids upcycle their results with this. So once you've said it out loud, you sit down and do that rewrite. It's just an iterative process. So you're not going to rewrite the whole thing. You're just going to hit that first part that hurts, rewrite that part, read it again. Still doesn't feel good, rewrite that next part, read it again, and get to the part where when you read it out loud, you feel lighter, freer, happier, and you know it's right. Mm-hmm. Once you know it's right, the fourth step is, like we talked about earlier, it's doing the work. You have to implant this new story in your subconscious, and you have to get a new neural pathway so that this becomes the only story that's triggered when you think of that event or that part of your life. Mm-hmm. That takes work. So I tell people, you write it down and you at least tell it to yourself twice a day. You tell it to yourself right before you go to bed at night, first thing when you wake up. If it's an appropriate story and you can hang it up on your mirror somewhere else where you're triggered to read it another couple times a day, that's great. And you're going to do this for at least 30 days. 60 to 90 is better, but at least 30 days to try to create that new neural pathway. And then you're going to make it part of your lived oral tradition. You're going to call up a trusted friend, someone you can share this with. You're going to go out to drinks. We're all starting to be able to kind of do that again, or dinner. And you're going to tell them, I was suffering. Here's this bad story I had. Here's my new story about it. I'm doing much better now. And you're going to share it. And by doing that, you're going to start to rewrite that new neural pathway to where when you're triggered, it's only your new story that comes up. Right. As of now, when I talk about my mom's death, it's only that I fought for my mom in every way I could while respecting her right to die her way story that comes up. The old one only comes up for the purposes of conversations like this. Yeah. And if you find one day you get triggered and the old story rears its ugly head, you just go back and do the work. And so step four is that's the important part is doing the work of making this new story a part of you, telling it yourself over and over and over again, because you've told that old story a million times to yourself. So you need to work past that with the new one.
Yeah. Wow. That was awesome. I love that the whole developing the new neural pathway. And I can say to people, because I work with people that are in grief, mostly parents, and they're like, how do I get to where you are? And like, well, first of all, you have to understand it's been 6 years. So it doesn't happen overnight. And it really didn't start happening for me, probably really in earnest till about 2 years ago. So it took a while to really get there, but it's that everyday thing. It's the reason why my daughter is in my background on my Zoom, because when I look at myself on the Zoom, I see my daughter over my shoulder. And that's the story I tell myself, that she's still here. I have pictures of my daughter in my house. The first thing when I open my bedroom door in the morning to come down the stairs, I see a giant picture of my daughter and I tell her good morning. So this is a story that I tell myself over and over every day and have been for years until I believe it, until I've internalized it. And as you said, it doesn't mean I don't get triggered by the old story sometimes and I don't feel bad for myself sometimes, but I can quickly switch back to the other story because of the neuroscience that you're talking about, all the work that we do to retrain ourselves.
Yeah. And that, I think what you said is really important in that people, I think, often look at grief as this linear process. And we have these 7 steps, which is great, like the Kubler-Ross stuff. But even Kubler-Ross, and I forget the gentleman who worked with her, he wrote his own book afterwards as well. And then
David
later,
Kessler.
Kessler, yeah. And Kessler lost his own son later in life and then experienced this. And even Kessler says the number one battle in his own life, and even in conversations with Kubler-Ross about doing an update to the book, their number one challenge was always getting people to understand it's not a linear process. You'll recover a bit, and then you'll take a hit, and then you'll get triggered, and then you'll cycle back into it. So the steps of grief, just like our life isn't an up and to the right hockey stick, neither is the recovery from grief. You're going to take a hit and you're going to fall right back into that place. I tell people, and now this is a dated reference, some of the people listening might not be old enough to get what I'm saying, but your brain is like a record player, and there's grooves cut in it. Some of them are shallow, some of them are deep, and traumatic events, grief events cut the deepest ruts. And when you take a hit in life, bang, the needle bounces and it always lands in the deepest ruts. And so you're always going to find your way back to that place. And so the key isn't to have the goal be to a point where you're not experiencing grief. Once you've experienced grief, it's yours for the rest of your life. The goal is to develop a set of practices and processes that allow you to overcome it when it comes for you. I tell people, grief is a demon you have to make a home for. You can't exercise it. You can't get it out of you. You find a place where it can live, where you're in control of it, where it can't come for you and bring you to your knees when you don't want it to, but where it's there when you want it. There's moments where I want it. There's moments where I want to sit down and think about the loss of my mom and experience that and reach through that void and use that grief as a connection to who I've lost. Yeah. It's not all bad. But I have to be in control of it. If it can come from me, like in the early days, and I hate sharing this stuff, right? It doesn't feel good to admit this stuff, but we need to say it, especially as men. In the early days, 41 days after my mom's death, my son was born and I'd have a newborn. My wife had a traumatic birth, so she was laid up for several weeks after the birth. And so I did a lot of the early care with my son, and the grief would come for me. I'd have to set him down in his swing and then buckle down behind the kitchen island and sob, and it would just come for me when I didn't want it to. When I wasn't in control of it, it could come and take me down. I'm sure you've experienced.
Yes, absolutely. Similar. Yeah, absolutely.
And so the first part of the work is just finding a home for that grief where it doesn't come for you when you don't want it to. You can grab it and get it when you need it, but it can't take you down when you don't want it to. And that's, once you've done that, you're step one. You're beyond the survival stage. You're getting your feet under you again.
Yeah. Yeah. I call that the white knuckle stage. Because clients that come to me that are early in it, I'm like, okay, before we talk about healing, before we talk about growing, before we talk about, transforming, we got to white knuckle through the first part of this, and again, there's no time frame, 6 months, a year. It's different for everybody. It's just hanging on, it's just hanging on and getting up and doing the things you need to do. And so I want people to understand this is not, we're not making light of the work that is required to be done. And it's not an easy path, but it's something that you can do, and it's worth doing. I was just on a forum earlier today, and someone said, does the grief ever stop? And people have different opinions about this. I don't think it ever stops. I think it transforms. I'm by myself right now. I work from home, and just a few minutes ago before we got on, I was thinking about my daughter. Right? I got a package in the mail. It was a birthday gift I bought for myself to remind myself of my daughter, and it came in, and I was thinking about her, and I'm like, I got melancholy, and that's okay because I allow that to happen at certain times, but I don't let it overtake me. And I don't let that be my permanent state. My permanent state that I return to is that, I'm in control of this, and that we're in control of this, and that, I did everything I could do, as you said, with your mother and stuff. And this is okay. This is my life, and I'm going to make the best of it.
Yeah. And that getting to the point where you're not really trying to battle this thing. Like in Western culture, everything is a battle. So part of the reason my mom's death was so hard is because I'm used to battling death. We're really good at fighting it right up until the bitter end. What we're not good at is saying, this is your time, and I'm going to stand here and support you through it. What we don't get is, at least in Western culture, we don't get cultural training in how to do that and how to be present and accept that this is what is supposed to happen right now.
Right.
And so, one of my favorite quotes about grief is that grief is love with nowhere left to go, right? That pain of grief is love with nowhere left to go. And being able to do what you did, accept that melancholy, reach across that void, it gives you a conduit for that love again, for that love for your daughter. Like, here's this thing that reminds me of her. I'm going to pour a little love into that. That's going to hurt. And that's the relationship now. That's part of the relationship. There's no parenting relationship that doesn't involve pain. Any parents that are listening, this is not for the faint of heart, raising children. And same with my relationship with my mom. If I need to connect with her and reach across that void, there's a price to pay for that. And that's why I don't believe the grief goes away. You just get to the point where you can manage it and use it in a way that is appropriate in your life. I can grab it and use it to connect with mom, or I can grab it and create meaning out of it and use it like in the form of the book to help change people's lives. I say in the book that my mom's last lesson to me was how to recover from the worst day of my life. And now, because I've been a guide my whole life, then my impetus is to teach as soon as I learn something that's valuable. So she taught me through her death how to recover from the worst day of my life. And now I'm on a mission to teach as many people to do that, to change their lives one story at a time, and get to the point where they're in control of these things. We can't stop them. We can't prevent them from happening, but we can choose how we move forward and walk with them.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. So what are the core 4 and why are they so important?
Yeah. So I said, I did like a 2-year deep dive, or I call it a personal PhD or a black belt in happiness and the science of story. And so we talked a little bit about the science of story, but I also found myself at a point where most of my life, I've been a pretty happy-go-lucky guy. And I could not get happy again after the death of my mom. I couldn't get to that state where I could say to you, yeah, I'm happy. And it's almost like if you've ever struggled with sleep, right? Like the worst part of struggling with sleep is you just sit there and be like, I can't sleep. Why can't I sleep? And now you're stressing about not sleeping, right? And so you can't sleep.
Right.
And happiness is the same thing. Why am I not happy? How come I can't get happy? Well, what used to make me happy? And you go through these machinations. And when you dive into the research, you realize that you had no idea what made you happy. Everything you thought made you happy wasn't actually what was doing it. And the science of happiness is a lot more simple than we thought. This is really better living through chemistry, not the chemistry you find in a shot glass or a pill bottle, but neurochemistry. So there are predictable, neurochemicals, serotonin, dopamine that will create happiness in the brain. It creates the right neurochemical environment for happiness in the brain. Now, if you're still suffering from your bad stories, there's no amount of doing these things that's going to overcome that, because you've got this sort of this pall of this bad story hanging over you. So the first step is to get those stories out of the way. And then the core 4 are 4 daily habits that will help you create the optimum neurochemical environment in the brain. And if you do them every day, they have a synergistic effect. So the first one is getting 8 hours of sleep a night, which now you're on the other side. You got adult children, but right now I got a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old. I was up at midnight, 1:50 in the morning, 3:50 in the morning. Then they woke me up at 6:30 between nightmares and pee breaks and everything else. Right. So it's hard. Not everybody can swing getting a full 8 hours of sleep every night, but do your best and create a routine and practices of turning off your phone, ending screen time early enough. Create a practice that gets you into bed to the point where you have the best chance, at least, of getting 8 hours sleep a night.
Yeah.
And everybody hears what I don't like to do is add things to people's health to-do list without explaining why. I think so much of this has been pop culturalized to where we've lost the why. We just have the prescription, and it's like, well, I got to eat fatty steaks, drink kale shakes, brush my teeth for 2 minutes a day. And now Rich is telling me I got to meditate and get 8 hours sleep and go for a run. I don't have enough time in my day to do all the stuff I'm supposed to take care of myself.
Exactly.
So, I'm not trying to add things to your health to-do list. I'm trying to give you sort of a lifelong practice. This can be done in less than an hour a day. It doesn't have to be a morning routine. It's an all-day routine. Just get it done. And if you do it consistently, it really pays off over time. So 8 hours of sleep is most important because you have your amygdala, which is sort of your drunken, belligerent buddy at the bar who's always ready for a fight. That's the anger center of your brain, the amygdala. And then you've got your medial prefrontal cortex up here, which is your mild-mannered accountant buddy, Chip. And so when your amygdala gets pissed at the bar and wants to swing, Chip pats him on the leg, says, that guy's not so bad. Maybe you shouldn't knock him out, right? Well, when you miss one night of sleep, there's a prefrontal cortex amygdala disconnect. And what we see is 60% greater anger response to negative stimuli after missing one night of sleep. So all of a sudden, Chip's not invited to the party and, your buddy's there ready to swing on everybody. That's why you find yourself grumpy as heck with your wife or with your children after you've missed a night of sleep, or why so many people get in so many fights early on when you have a newborn, because nobody's getting sleep. Everybody's ramped up. And so why sleep is so important is because it keeps the natural checks and balances in your brain to keep sort of an emotional monotone up there. And if you take those checks and balances off, all of a sudden you've got wild emotional swings. And as we all know, wild emotional swings are not a recipe for happiness or success.
Yeah.
And then the second one of the core 4 is 30 to 45 minutes of exercise, cardiovascular exercise. This isn't like, running wind sprints, up at the high school. You could just take the dog for a walk, just get your heart rate up for 30 to 45 minutes. But what they find is, they have equal rates of reduction in major depression by doing 30, 45 minutes of exercise a day as they do by giving people an antidepressant like Zoloft. Like the Duke Smile studies, they did both, and they found that they had equal rates of reduction in mass depression diagnosis and 30% less recidivism back into major depression in the exercise group.
Yeah, I just want to have you pause there for a moment, because I've heard that same research, and I think this is so important, because people will often turn to a pill for depression or anxiety or whatever, and I'm not a medical expert. I don't think you are either. So we're not giving medical advice here. If your doctor prescribes it, then you should do it. But there's certain things that we can do. And this is one that I do myself. I walk for an hour and 45 minutes every day. And I've found it just completely changes my mood. And if I can't walk for a couple of days, that completely changes my mood. So I just wanted to interject that.
Absolutely. And I do want to be clear that if you're suffering from major depression, if you're having thoughts of harming yourself, going for a jog isn't going to do it. You owe it to yourself and your family to call it the 800 number right now, get immediate help for that. But this helps you with a general case of the downers or the Mondays or the pandemic blues. This helps you maintain a sort of a neutral to happy emotional state consistently over time. It's not a prescription for major depressive episodes if you're having thoughts of harming yourself, but it is just tremendously powerful over time to maintain your mental state.
Yeah. Yeah.
So luckily, I didn't go there in the 2 years I was depressed. I never once had a moment where I felt like committing suicide or harming myself. And I'm very thankful and grateful that wasn't a place, for whatever reason, that wasn't a place I went to. Mm-hmm. But for so many people, they do, especially men in their 50s who lose work, lose direction, lose meaning in life. They tend to abuse drugs and alcohol and have high suicide rates because we don't have the same built-in social support networks that, say, women do. We just don't reach out to each other to get help as much. And so, if you're a man and you're listening and you're really suffering right now, you need to go get help. Go for a jog, but call the 800 number while you're on that jog. Get some help.
Yeah. So you were on number 3. I interrupted.
Oh, yeah. Number 3 is mindfulness or meditation. Mm-hmm. And you can see the results of this in as little as 10 minutes. You're getting up to the point where you're doing 20 minutes to an hour a day is better, but just 10 minutes of some kind of mindfulness or meditation practice gives your brain a break, gives you a chance to settle down and calm and get recentered. But it also, over time, consistently does some really interesting things in the brain. So you've got that amygdala, that's that anger center of the brain. Consistent meditation over years, you can start to see the effects in even as little as a few months, but consistently over years, they find it actually thins out the tissue in the amygdala. So you actually have a less dense mass of tissue working on negative stimuli in your brain. Mm-hmm. So you're doing this thing that it gives you a break. It brings your blood pressure down, has all these benefits that people are aware of meditation. But one of the things I think doesn't get highlighted is that it's making physical, structural, functional changes in the way your brain works and reacts to negative stimuli. So your buddy who's just really calm and serene all the time, who's been a lifelong meditator, his brain is actually different than yours. His brain is actually structurally different than yours. And he has different responses to things than you do. And that makes a dramatic difference. So even if you can only squeeze in 10 minutes, if you do 10 minutes every day, you're going to change your brain in a profound way that will have lifelong impacts for you. And all kinds of other great stuff too. Like they see almost 0 rates of dementia in lifelong meditators, things like that. These meditations really powerful on a lot of levels, but from a happiness perspective, it tamps down that response to negative stimuli. So remember, you're anthropologically preset to bring in negative information, negative stimuli. And now you're taking the time to get your brain to calm down and not respond so profoundly to that.
Awesome. Yeah.
And so you can start to see how these have a synergy, right? You get 8 hours of sleep, so you keep the medial prefrontal cortex and the amygdala connected, so it's calming it down. And then meditation is thinning out the amygdala, so it's calming it down. And then the exercise is dropping the serotonin and the dopamine and the happiness-inducing chemicals, and it's calming it all down. So these things all kind of work together to calm the brain for happiness. And then the last one is the daily gratitude practice. And this is where, like a lot of people will click off on the podcast because they've read like 52 articles about gratitude and they're over it. They're tired of people telling them to be grateful for every little thing in their life. But the reason gratitude is powerful is because it helps you pattern your world for the positive. So you have that anthropological preset to bring in negative bits of information.
Yeah.
You take time during gratitude to feed your brain positive bits of information. So you now have more positive bits of information to compile your stories from. It also, I think what's gotten lost in the shuffle is the actual feeling of gratitude, right? So people tell you gratitude practice, get out a journal, write down 3 things you're grateful for. Boom, you do it, you're done. You didn't do much. You made a list. You gave yourself some positive.
Yeah.
Yeah. You give yourself some positive, bits of information, but the real work is to stop on each one of those things. If you're saying, I'm grateful for my son or my daughter, is actually stop and close your eyes and at least try to muster up the physical feeling of being grateful for that for at least 10 seconds, 30 seconds to a minute is better on each of the things you're grateful for. Yeah. And it's bringing up that feeling of gratitude that's going to do the work in your brain, and that's going to do the work to create sort of a lifelong approach to looking for the good and the positive in your world. So you combine all 4 of those things. You get the bad stories out of your way. You combine all 4 of those things, and you remember that happiness is not beyond the next promotion. It's not when you lose the weight. It's not when you get married. It's not when you graduate college. Happiness is now. You have to fight for it every day. And you do the work and you do the core 4, you can create that right environment in the brain to have this sort of consistent happiness. One of the problems we have is we argue over the definition of happiness in kind of the most widely accepted one is eudaimonia, which is like human flourishing, right? That sounds good. I want to flourish, but it doesn't really get to the sort of the core of what we're trying to do, of creating this sort of vitality and this vibrance to move forward in a consistent way in life. So we're not looking for that giggling idiot, happy all the time kind of happiness. We're looking for that sort of vibrant, positive momentum, steadfast, moving forward, consistent happiness. And that's where learning these tricks to make your brain do what you want it to do creates that over time by being consistent.
Yeah, I got to say, I guess I just stumbled across the core 4 over the course of my last 6 years, but I do all 4 of those. And I find them very, very, and that the gratitude thing, when I first heard it, and people that are in grief or people tell themselves bad stories are going to go, I have nothing to be grateful for. And I guarantee you, no matter who you are, where you are, you have something to be grateful for. And so that practice I find is very important, but you're right. It's not just writing a list. It's actually sitting with that feeling. And you started with the 8 hours of sleep, and then you talked about the mindfulness. It was so wild because I woke up about 3:00 this morning. I was having trouble getting back to sleep, and my mind was racing. I was thinking about things, and I went back to my mindfulness practice, and I went back to, let me just start taking deep breaths and counting backwards from 10 and focusing on my breath. And next thing I knew, all those things that my mind was racing towards, they were like fading into the background. And when they would come up, I would just push them out of the way, and I fell back to sleep. And I found that the mindfulness practice really helps with the sleep practice. It's really just, it's that getting that feeling and that understanding of, I don't have to follow these thoughts where they are. Because usually when we can't sleep, it's because something's in our mind. Something has got us chasing it, and we can just say, no, I'm not going to chase that right now.
Yeah. And it's funny you mentioned that, because I would say that the gratitude practice is what saved me from the grief of the death of my mom. Gratitude is what pulled me up. I have a gratitude journal that I'm just religious with since I did this research. And that's what pulled me up and started to get my feet under me happiness wise. But meditation, mindfulness is what has sort of gotten me through the pandemic, with the sort of stress and anxiety and shepherding a young family through this insanity, of the global pandemic we've just been through. And the sort of having sleep problems around that, especially in the beginning. Using the mindfulness practice to get me to sleep, I've now developed, the ability to really go to sleep no matter what's going on in my life. I can really just dig into that mindfulness practice and go to sleep. Now, I think some sort of pure meditation practitioners would poo-poo that because they don't want you falling asleep during a meditation practice. But I've got a pretty clear line where if I'm sitting up, I can stay awake. So I can do my seated meditation. But if I'm laying down, I can use that meditation reliably, like you say, to calm the mind and go right back to sleep. And that it's really powerful and really pays dividends down the road using it that way.
Yeah, it was funny because as I was doing that, I was, like I said, this was literally just last night. I had a meditation or a hypnosis session like a week ago. And so I went back to that feeling when I was being hypnotized. And the thing is, then I was fighting to sleep because I'm like lying in my bed and this person's, I was over Zoom and they hypnotized me. And I was like, she said, a lot of times people fall asleep. So I'm like, well, let me just go to that space. And I went to that space last night. I was out. So it was kind of like, it's like self-hypnosis, but yeah. So those 4 things you talked about, I think are really important, and they're small changes. They don't have to be, like you said, you don't have to go to the gym. you can take 20 minutes after dinner and go for a walk. Just get out in nature and walk. And I was actually talking to a therapist, and she said the thing about walking is it's bilateral movement. So it's actually helping, you're engaging both sides of your brain. So it's another reason why it's a really great exercise.
Yeah. And that's kind of touching on like bilateral stimulation of the brain is actually a really sort of core concept in actual technical therapy work to recover from grief, like EMDR. I don't know if you've engaged with any of that.
Yeah, I have. Mm-hmm.
But that's amazing. I did some EMDR, and that's amazing, using the bilateral stimulation of the brain to trigger the natural cleansing and consolidating process of memories and emotions, to help you have less dramatic responses to traumatic memories. And that's for people who are really suffering, for the people with PTSD and that sort of stuff. I can't recommend enough digging into EMDR and doing some of that bilateral stimulation to help this sort of natural cleansing and consolidating process of the brain. That's incredible stuff. The science behind that is mind blowing.
It is. It really is. We touched upon this before we got started, and you just touched upon it a little bit. I want to talk about in our last few minutes about why is it that men seem to struggle so much more than women do with stuff like this. And we don't see even ourselves, like I don't see people like you much in this field, and vice versa. It seems like women are ahead of us on this thing.
Yeah, and it's always dangerous territory to talk about these gender roles, because you always risk sort of dropping the cliches and tropes. But I think we have some powerful stories about maleness that don't serve us. I talked about one of them, that sort of savior complex. I had a ramped up on steroids version of that from being a guide, but I think that's pretty innately built into men to sort of be that fixer, that savior. And there's an emotional stoicism that men are raised with that doesn't serve us. I mean, if you really dig into the Stoics, there's much to be gained there. Tremendous emotional resilience,
absolutely.
And great stuff. But where the type of stoicism we teach our young men, it tends to be compartmentalism, which is you have two emotions, happy or pissed. And if you're not happy or pissed, then you're not a man, right? That's it. Like sadness, anxiety, fear, grief, all of that's for the pansies, right? And that's at least still, being a child in the 70s, of a pretty old school dad, I got a healthy dose of that. And these archetypal versions of maleness, having a really sort of bipolar emotional range, doesn't serve us. So when we take a hit like grief, and when we're feeling the full range of complex emotions that come with that, and we're being brought to our knees, we don't want to admit it. We don't want to tell people. We don't want to reach out for help. Or at least I didn't. I like in my family, we are a pull yourself up by your bootstraps. If you're not bleeding a lot, quit whining and get on with it kind of family. Yeah. And so to admit you were depressed was to admit weakness, right? And so I think men have all these things built in that, it's, even something that we should be well past by now, but it's weak to cry, and these things we get, I don't know, there's so many places we get these things from, because I've never told my son it's bad to cry. He cries all the time when he gets hurt or whatever.
Sure.
But our family dog died recently, and because of COVID and having nobody to watch the kids, and I couldn't go with the dog. My wife went to put the dog down, and I was with her over FaceTime during that. And I was crying. Obviously, I was sobbing. This had been our dog for 12 years. And my son said, "Well, Dad, you're probably glad you didn't go, because you probably would have been embarrassed." So why would I have been embarrassed? He said, "Well, all those people seeing you cry like that." And I said, "No, it's not embarrassing to cry when you're losing someone you love. That's the right reaction, the normal reaction." So somewhere, I don't know where, he even got a dose of that story. That's crying's so embarrassing.
That's so sad, because you said we can't protect our kids from everything. So we think we're teaching the right thing, and then you find out this socialization has come in from somewhere outside of your influence.
Yeah. And so these stories of maleness, we need to rewrite those. And the most important work is on the personal level, but then in our work with our children, in our work with communities, in our work with our other male friends, we need to start to rewrite these stories. And sometimes it requires you to maybe be a bit nosy or bossy. So when any of my friends lose someone now, I interject myself. I send them text messages. I send them, DMs on Instagram. I send them I call them, I interact with them and just keep checking on them. And my male friends sometimes get annoyed or pissed about it, but there's this sort of acute period of suffering, as you know, when it first happens, when you lose someone, everybody's there, everybody's checking and calling you, bringing you food and everything, right? And that lasts a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
And then they didn't lose that person, they move on.
Right.
And then you're there with the everyday of not having them. You're there with the everyday experience of that, and we don't have that support. And so men in general, we don't reach out for those support, for that support. We don't have that community. Like women tend to have stronger social networks, like around parenting and being a mom. They have mom groups. They reach out to each other when they're having a hard day. They reach out to each other to get help with breastfeeding or raising a newborn. They have these sort of built-in communities that they develop more innately. And men, our communities are more based on doing things together, like going out and, fishing or whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think we've seen a declining life expectancy in the US for 3 years straight. And what the research is showing is it's driven by middle-aged men who have lost their job, especially like in the industrial Midwest. Mm-hmm. They lose their job in their 50s. They're not able to take care of their families. They lose direction. And then they're turning to alcohol and opioids, and then eventually overdose or suicide. And if those men had a stronger network where they could reach out and talk to people about what they're feeling, get help for how they're hurting, have other men who have gone through the same thing, tell them that there's an end to this, there's a way out of this, and give them a pathway, I think we could turn that around. And so to me, when I look at men in grief, the best thing you can do, anyone who knows a man in their life that's suffering, is to reach out, to get in their face a little bit, to offer help, to check on them, get them out of the house. Don't let them exile themselves. Don't let them be alone. Get them out, get them moving, and then share with them your suffering. So it's social media and this age of perfect lives. We seem to think that we make connections now by showing this perfectly glossed version of our lives, but it's in showing the beautiful fallibility, the suffering and the pain and the humanness that we make real connections. And as men, we got to start doing that. We got to start sharing the hard parts too. Yeah. I've been lucky enough during the pandemic. One of my best friends just said, man, we're talking to each other every day. We're both dads. We're both suffering through this thing. This is some crazy stuff we're dealing with. Even if it's 2 minutes, we're talking every day. And every single day for the pandemic, we check on each other and we give each other a chance to vent and talk about what's going on. And we just are there for each other. Yeah. And that is, I would say, a more woman or more feminine archetype of relationship, right? That's not like a dude setup. Yeah. And we need to start to evolve past that and be those resources for each other as men, and have these conversations. There's even a great YouTube video of Anderson Cooper and Stephen Colbert talking about grief, about the loss of their, I think Stephen Colbert lost his dad and his brothers, and Anderson Cooper recently lost his mom. I've never seen like public celebrities having that kind of discussion about grief, being open as men about what that's like. So just conversations like this, help other men to sort of reach in and say, yeah, okay, if he's admitting how he's feeling, I can do that too.
Yeah, that video you're talking about went viral because it was so unusual. I know the one you're talking about, and people are like, wow, this is wild that men are doing this. And I want to reiterate what you said to any men that happen to be listening, which there aren't many, but for the ones that are listening, is do that. After my daughter passed, I have a friend now. He's a former pastor. Maybe this is why he did it, but he would just call me up and say, let's go for a walk. Because he knows I walk every day, but we would go just meet at the bike trail and walk for 2 or 3 miles. And he'd check in with me and ask what's going on. And he's done this for years, just kept, following up with me. And that's really appreciated. And I'm not the kind of person, I'm not going to reach out to somebody and say, hey, I'm sad, I need to go, talk to you, because that's just not what guys do. So we need to, as guys, I love what you said, get up in your friend's face a little bit, invite them out, draw them out, and then share. After my daughter passed, people I've known for like literally 2 decades, neighbors, we were on vacation together a couple of years ago, and this guy starts telling me stories about his mother and his family and stuff like that, and I'm like, dude, I've known you for like 20 years and you've never told me this stuff before. But because I'm doing the podcast, I'm doing the speaking and stuff, my friends are hearing me a little bit. They're like, they have permission now to share what they're going through also. So being vulnerable really helps to draw other people out, letting them know it's okay to feel sad about this, or it's okay to, have these kind of emotions.
Yeah, my favorite moment of that was I was at a real estate conference out in Vegas, and we're at the like opening mixer thing, right? Which is, small talk, and you pretend like you do more deals than me, and we all talk about how cool we are, right? That's the kind of environment these things are. And this guy was asking me what I was doing. And at the time I was just finishing up the book. And I said, well, kind of one of the most exciting things in my life is I've just completed this book. And here's what it's about. I shared the story of the day my mom died. This guy was like a head and a half taller than me. He was like 6'4", 6'5", built like, a brick outhouse, huge New Yorker, and he starts telling me that the day the Twin Towers came down. So after I tell him my story, he starts telling me, I've been dealing with PTSD for decades now. And he said, I'm standing in my apartment window across from the Twin Towers. When the towers come down, I'm holding my newborn daughter and I watch this building collapse and everything gets enveloped in smoke. And I've got this child that I have to protect. I don't have an automobile. I have nothing. And I walked down out of the building with her in my arms, and I walked out of the city and I walked across the bridge with her. Wow. And I've been struggling with the fear and anxiety and the PTSD from that moment since then. And it's a constant battle in my life. He's like, I'm trying to, at the time he had just bought a house in Costa Rica that he was going down, and he bought some horses because dealing with the horses gave him some sense of calm and serenity, but he was really still going through it. This was maybe 3 or 4 years ago. Right. And, so we're almost 2 decades past 9/11.
Yeah.
But this big dude, by the end of this, 15, 20 minute conversation, this huge New Yorker bruiser dude is giving me a hug. He's got tears in his eyes, and we're connecting around this shared experience of trying to push our way through the hard things in life.
Right.
And so I like what you said about giving permission. If you're just willing to be vulnerable and just willing to be open with people, you'll be amazed. Every time I do this and talk about this, something like that happens. Someone shares with me what they've been through. And then there's an instant connection. We have so much separation now, political separation and so many things we're infighting about in this country. When really at the core, we are all walking this life out and experiencing these same universal things and trying to push our way through these things. Not in the same ways. We all have our own challenges, different challenges, some of us a lot more than others because of the structure. But we're still having these universal experiences we can connect on and start to build some bridges and understand each other's humanity. And this experience of grief is one of them that we can definitely do that with, because almost everybody has experienced this in some way or another.
Well, if they haven't, they will. That's just part of life. Well, Rich, I want to say we're coming up on about an hour, maybe a little over. I've really enjoyed the conversation with you today, and your book sounds really intriguing. So remind people the name of your book, where they can find out about your book, and where they can find out more about you.
The book's on Amazon in all 3 formats: audio, digital, and print. It's called Change Your Story, Change Your Life. Search Change Your Story, Change Your Life, Rich Curtis. It's the blue and yellow one. You can see it back there behind my head. And if you want to find me, you can just check me out at richcurtis.com. We've got individual coaching, group coaching, speaking, all that stuff. Anything that I can do to support you in getting your stories straight and moving forward in your life. That's what I'm here to do. Thanks for having me. It was a wonderful conversation. Thanks for being open and sharing your grief and doing this work as a man in the world. It's great to have some people out there doing that and sharing that and giving a pathway forward for people to see that this is okay. Yeah,
cool. Well, thanks for being here. Have a great rest of your day.
You too.
Thanks for listening to Grief to Growth. Brian hopes that you find this episode helpful and will come back for future episodes. Brian's best-selling book, Grief to Growth, Planted Not Buried, is a great resource for anyone who is coping with grief or knows someone who is. If you enjoy the podcast and would like to support it, there are 3 things you can do to help. The first is to share the podcast with someone that you think it will help. The second is to go to iTunes, rate, and review the episode. The third way you can support the podcast is by becoming a patron. Head over to www.patreon.com/grief2growth. That's patreon.com/grief, the number 2, growth, and sign up to make a small monthly donation. Patrons get access to exclusive bonus content and knowledge that you are helping to spread the message of grief to growth. For more about Brian and Grief to Growth, visit www.grief2growth.com.
Hi there. I hope you enjoyed this latest episode of the podcast, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. What questions came up for you? What did you like about it? What didn't you like about it? I invite you to visit us at growth2growth.circle.so. That's growth2growth.circle.so to continue the conversation with me and with other listeners. It's a space to sound off, to share reactions, and to go deeper into the topics from the show. I look forward to chatting more, and I hope to see you there.